There comes a moment, rare but unforgettable, when the storm pauses. Not because the winds have died, but because someone dared to stand in its eye and speak. Today is that moment. Across deserts and distant shores, while the world held its breath, a quiet decision echoed louder than 1,000 war drums. Iran has halted its strikes, and what could have been the spark of something terrible now flickers instead with the fragile glow of a second chance. This did not come easy. No peace worth having ever does. In the heart of Qatar, leaders who once saw only opposition sat across from one another, not as enemies, but as human beings. There were no victors today, only survivors of a decision that might just shape the rest of our century. This isn't just a headline, it's a heartbeat, a turning point, a whisper of sanity in a world that often shouts madness. So let us now walk together through this story, not with fear, but with understanding, not with division, but with perspective. And may we remember, history is not made only by bombs, but also by the brave choice to stop. In a world seemingly addicted to conflict, the true miracle is not in the waging of war, but in the willingness to talk. The first keynote in this unfolding moment is the power of dialogue in a world on edge. When nations square off and missiles are loaded, it is easy to believe that the path forward is carved in violence. But something remarkable happened when the clock seemed to be ticking toward devastation. Words replaced warfare. The very act of sitting across the table, when emotions are inflamed, when trust is shattered, is a courageous one. It defies the instinct to strike first and think later. It calls for something deeper than strategy. It demands humility. The Iran-Qatar emergency talks were not simply a meeting. They were an act of resistance against fear, against pride, and against the old habit of retaliation. In those critical hours, where one wrong sentence could ignite chaos, leaders chose restraint. And restraint in moments of fury is strength, not weakness. It takes power to launch a missile, but it takes character to call it back. Dialogue is often dismissed as soft in a world that measures strength by firepower, but real power lies in the ability to de-escalate. Talking does not erase pain, nor does it rewrite history, but it opens a door. And sometimes the smallest opening can flood a room with light. It allows grievances to breathe and aspirations to be heard. It transforms faceless threats into voices with names, with stories, with sons and daughters waiting back home. In this case, the ability to speak, and more importantly, to listen, brought two nations back from the brink. It is easy to imagine that we are always just one decision away from war. But what if we are also one conversation away from peace? That is what this ceasefire symbolizes, not a declaration of eternal harmony, but a fragile admission that violence is not inevitable. When leaders speak instead of strike, they rewrite what is possible. They remind the world that behind the flags and borders are people who feel, who bleed, who hope. Iran's decision to halt its strikes did not arise in a vacuum. It emerged from a willingness to hear and be heard. In the shadow of escalation, dialogue became the light. The power of speech, of carefully chosen words, held more influence than the threats of retaliation. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of victory. As the dust settles and the ceasefire takes hold, let us not overlook the lesson buried beneath the politics. Dialogue remains our best tool in a dangerous world. It is not perfect. It does not always succeed. But every time we choose words over war, we take a step, not just away from destruction, but towards something far greater, understanding. In a time when the world feels close to tearing apart, that understanding may be the only thing that holds it together. Qatar, often seen merely as a small but wealthy nation in the Gulf, transformed overnight into something far greater, a bridge between conflict and calm. Its role in the emergency talks between Iran and its counterparts was not just logistical or ceremonial, it was symbolic. When chaos knocks on the world's door, someone must open it not with panic, but with poise. Qatar became that someone. Amid the storm of accusations and rising tensions, it offered a neutral ground, a soft voice, and a space where swords could be sheathed, even if only temporarily. In times of looming conflict, geography often matters less than courage, and Qatar displayed that courage, not in loud declarations, but in quiet persistence. Behind closed doors, beneath the shadow of a potential regional war, it brought adversaries together. No easy task. These were not polite disagreements. These were deep, tangled resentments, seasoned by history and pride. Yet in Doha, under dim lights and the burden of global expectation, conversations began. The very presence of these leaders in the same room signaled something extraordinary, that peace, however temporary, was worth pursuing. There's something almost sacred about the role of a mediator. It requires neutrality without apathy, empathy without bias. Qatar stood in that sacred space with clarity. It did not try to dominate the narrative, nor did it seek the spotlight. Instead, it allowed the dialogue to unfold organically, delicately navigating mistrust and ego. That's what diplomacy at its best looks like. Not grand speeches, but open ears. Not posturing, but patience. While missiles were on standby and headlines screamed impending doom, Qatar worked quietly. In a world addicted to noise, it chose silence. In a landscape filled with accusations, it offered an invitation to talk, to reconsider, to pause. That kind of leadership is rare. It's not about size, it's about spirit. And in that moment, the spirit of Qatar lifted a heavy burden off the shoulders of a trembling region. This ceasefire is not just a triumph of policy, it is a tribute to what happens when smaller nations step up with greater vision, when they refuse to be spectators to tragedy and choose instead to become architects of peace. In a time where trust between nations feels like a relic, Qatar demonstrated that trust can still be built, carefully, tenderly, one conversation at a time. Let the world take note, the quiet players can still change the game. The smallest platforms can host the largest transformations. What happened in Qatar should not be underestimated. It didn't just halt missiles, it disrupted momentum. It interrupted hatred. It dared to believe that peace talks were still possible in a cynical world. And in doing so, it gave humanity one more reason to hope. One more reminder that diplomacy, however bruised, is not dead. It's breathing. And in Qatar, it breathed just long enough to save countless lives. The ceasefire may dominate the headlines, but what lies beneath it is far more delicate and profound, the fragile and sacred nature of peace itself. Peace is often celebrated with cheers, headlines, and international praise, but true peace isn't a single moment of agreement. It's a commitment, a burden, a daily vow not to fall back into the easier path of violence. In truth, peace is not the end of a journey, but the most treacherous beginning. It takes tremendous effort to go to war, but it takes even more to maintain peace. War is loud, chaotic, and absolute. Peace, by contrast, is subtle. It requires vigilance. It asks for patience, understanding, compromise, traits often missing in the heat of geopolitics. This ceasefire, fragile as it may be, is not a trophy to place on a mantle. It is a candle flickering in the wind, and the world must now protect it. Not because it guarantees a perfect future, but because it prevents a terrible one. The very act of halting strikes doesn't erase the rage or the pain that led to them. It doesn't dissolve the history that brewed the tension in the first place. What it does do is create space, a sacred space where healing could happen. Could, but only if both sides and those watching from afar understand the value of what has been preserved. Too often, peace is mistaken for weakness, yet it is one of the hardest choices a nation can make. To stay the hand, to swallow pride, to risk looking vulnerable for the sake of something greater, that's not weakness, that is maturity, that is vision. Every hour that follows a ceasefire is a test. The guns are quiet, but the minds are still loud. Suspicion, blame, and wounded pride echo in every corner of leadership. There will be provocations, and the temptation to retaliate will whisper with seductive clarity. But peace requires saying no to that voice, over and over again, and that's where real strength is proven, not on the battlefield, but in the restraint that prevents one. This moment in history is not secured by signatures or camera flashes. It is secured by discipline, by the kind of inner fortitude that most people will never see, but generations will benefit from if it holds. That is the power and the price of peace. It must be watered daily with trust, guarded by transparency, and fed by dialogue. Left unattended, it wilts, but nurtured, it becomes the single most powerful gift any generation can pass to the next. The world must now rise to the responsibility that comes with this fragile calm. Leaders must resist the urge to declare victory and instead declare vigilance, because peace, real peace, isn't declared, it's lived every day. In decisions big and small, in courage, quiet and loud, and in the hope that the silence between explosions becomes not the exception, but the norm. When the news of the ceasefire broke, the ripples spread far beyond political circles and military command rooms. They reached the ordinary people, the ones who bear the heaviest cost of conflict and yet are rarely invited to the negotiating table. For them, this ceasefire was not merely a strategic pause or a diplomatic maneuver. It was hope, rekindled, the kind of hope that slips away quietly in times of war, only to return like a whisper when the world dares to pause and breathe again. In towns and villages scattered across the region, families heard the news and looked to the sky with relief, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because the bombing had stopped. That alone was a miracle. For the mother who feared losing her child to a misfired drone, for the father who prayed his son wouldn't be conscripted into a senseless war, for the children whose nights have been haunted by sirens instead of lullabies, this ceasefire offered something intangible but precious, the chance to exhale. Hope doesn't need perfection. It only needs a crack in the wall, a single opening where light can seep in. That's what this ceasefire represents. In the middle of ongoing chaos, it's a quiet signal that something better is still possible. It tells the world's citizens, especially those closest to the front lines, that diplomacy is not a forgotten art, that the machinery of war, for all its noise, can still be overpowered by the quieter, steadier force of reason. There is no denying the trauma that lingers. People have lost homes, futures, and loved ones, and no ceasefire can undo that kind of sorrow. But it can begin to stop the bleeding. It can allow for conversations to resume, for aid to flow, for children to walk to school without fear. It can let people return to their routines, not with total peace of mind, but with at least a momentary sense of safety. And sometimes that's all a community needs to begin rebuilding. Just one moment where hope doesn't feel like a lie. What took place in Qatar and what followed across borders gave the world a glimpse of how rapidly things can shift when people choose to believe in something greater than retaliation. Hope spread, not because someone declared it, but because people felt it. The absence of explosions, the presence of stillness, the return of birdsong in places where smoke once filled the air. These aren't just symbols. They're affirmations that peace, even fragile, temporary peace, is powerful enough to change hearts. Let us never forget that while governments strategize, it is the people who dream. And in this fleeting moment of calm, millions are dreaming again, not just of survival, but of living. That is the real measure of hope. Not its grandeur, but its reach. And now, for the first time in a long while, hope is reaching the people who need it most. Now is not the time to grow comfortable. A ceasefire, while welcome, is not a destination. It's a signpost. It says the road ahead could lead to peace, but only if we stay awake. Only if we refuse to let our guard down, not in fear of war returning, but in fear of letting our moment of clarity slip away. Because history has shown us this pattern too many times. The guns fall silent, the world breathes a sigh of relief, and then the silence is mistaken for safety. Slowly, sleep returns, vigilance fades, and before long, the mistakes of the past are repeated under the illusion of calm. This moment right now is critical. It is not the end of conflict. It is the pause that decides what comes next. The decisions made in this fragile window will either reinforce the peace or unravel it. That's why staying alert, mentally, morally, and politically, is not a choice, but a necessity. Complacency is the enemy of sustained peace. When nations assume that the hardest part is over, they neglect the harder truth. Maintaining peace is often more difficult than achieving a ceasefire. Leaders must now be more transparent, more intentional, and more honest than ever before. The real test of courage is not how boldly one fights, but how wisely one prevents the next fight. This isn't about posturing for the global stage. It's about laying real foundations, accountability, continued dialogue, confidence-building measures. This is the quiet, gritty work that doesn't make headlines but builds history. And beyond the leaders, the global public must stay awake too. We must not look away, not now, because while politicians meet in well-lit rooms, it is the ordinary people, the displaced, the wounded, the grieving, who carry the weight of decisions made far from home. They don't have the luxury of forgetting, neither should we. To stay awake means to keep asking the hard questions, to follow through on promises made in press conferences, to demand that the ceasefire becomes a stepping stone, not a public relations victory. It means recognizing propaganda when it returns and rejecting the narratives that will surely try to divide again. It means educating ourselves and others, keeping compassion alive long after the media spotlight dims. Let this not be just another chapter in a long book of unresolved tensions. Let it be the beginning of a shift, a deeper understanding of how fragile peace is and how urgent it is to protect it. Let the silence of the guns remind us of the noise they replaced, and let that memory keep us awake, vigilant, and committed. Because the world doesn't change by accident. It changes because people stayed awake long enough to make sure it did. And right now we've been given that chance. The question is, what will we do with it?